Thank you for being here, everybody. Welcome to Suds and Science, and welcome to the very first Suds and Science right here in our very own office. Life is about change, and I'm embracing this change. And it feels great to have people invited into our home space. Welcome to our home. Feel free to raid the table on the way out of drinks and food and stuff. As always, thank you to Jordan and the crew from JAM for filming tonight's event. If we have a question, I don't know how our speaker, you can take questions throughout the evening at the end, and they're going to repeat their question into the lapel mic so it gets recorded for the folks online. If you don't know me, my name is Jason Hill. I am the long-term host of Suds and Science for going on a decade now. I've been doing this. And this is just an opportunity in a low-pressure situation to encounter some science casually and to go away learning a little, to having learned a little bit and knowing more than you came in. So please don't be intimidated, lean in, ask questions. That we embrace that learning philosophy here. So I'm a quantitative ecologist, and you have come into our building. We are a bunch of conservation biologists, a bunch of researchers who do very applied conservation work throughout the Western Hemisphere, from uptake of mercury and aquatic food webs to migratory birds and quantitative modeling of population dynamics of threatened and endangered species. So if you found our office, now you can definitely find our website and learn a little more about it if you want to. I'm so happy to have a crowd and have you here tonight at Suds. I grew up, as a way of introducing our speaker tonight, I grew up in a little town in Iowa. Hi, Mom. Love you, Mom. And that town in Iowa, Marshalltown, Iowa, is surrounded by, like the rest of the state, 85% corn and soybeans. So imagine Vermont, but just squashed, elevationally speaking, and 100 more rivers, but then take every tree here and substitute that for a stalk of corn or soybeans. And that's the sea I grew up in. And as a kid, I thought, how can anything survive in this monotonous landscape of industrial agriculture? And I thought, how can there be biodiversity? How can there be anything that can eke out of existence in this chemically awashed, industrial harvested place? And I guess like Tom Waits said, I never saw the West Coast till I moved to the East. I never appreciated the biodiversity that existed in pockets struggling to maintain a hold in Iowa until I left and came back later. I'm really excited for Dr. Linden's talk tonight about how this amphibian population, assemblage of frog species, exists in this agricultural working land space in India. I'm really pleased to have Lilly here tonight. Please, Suds of Science, welcome for Dr. Linden. Thanks, Lilly.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jason. That was a good segue into all of the talk, basically. Before going any further, though, I would like to properly give you a background of who I am, where I come from, and how I'm here. My name is Lilly Linden. Yes, I always struggle to fill out forms. Never enough room. I use the she series of pronouns, and currently I work as a librarian at Dartmouth. Before that, I was a little kid in India, grew up there until I was 21. And at 5, though, I was so sure that I was going to be a conservation biologist. Like nothing else mattered in the world. I was going to be a conservation biologist. So I did all the things that you do. You go to school, attend all the classes that you need to, take all the science classes, start finding internships, doing research. And when I was about 14, I applied for a summer research program, and the lab studied amphibians. I'd never really thought about studying frogs before that. Birds were my thing. I was like, I had my little kiddo binoculars and field guide and all of that stuff. And then started working in this lab. And the moment I started telling people that I worked studying amphibians, there was this look on their face, like, ew. And I was like, yes. The little rebel in me was like, yes, that's what it didn't make things any worse that, most herpetology work, especially when you come to studying frogs, occurs nocturnally. And I hated waking up early for bird surveys, setting up mist nets. That was not fun for me. So it was one of those things where I was like, oh, wait a minute, multiple things. What I did do in that lab was study amphibian larval behavior. So I spent a lot of time indoors, looking at little aquaria, so think long rectangular glass tanks, and you release a tadpole here, and you have a little piece of spinach there, or like a little some other chemical cue, and kind of trying to gauge preferences for different species of tadpoles, and it was a lot of fun. I also was really bored because you would run this repeat over and over and over, n equal to 300, 400, 600, 800. And when you're 17, after a while that gets really boring. Anyway, so I'd started being interested in working with amphibians, but I knew I wanted to do more field-based work, and kept applying to things. And I don't know the year, but I was about 17. I was in first year of undergrad when the Smithsonian from the US actually held a Indo-Smithsonian conservation diversity kind of exchange program. So 7 professors from the US, 7 from India, 7 graduate students from the US, 7 from India, and of course I was the only undergrad that squeaked in because didn't have anything to do, didn't look at the eligibility on the application, squeaked in a letter, and they were like, yeah, whatever, we'll let this harmless person join. So I had no research experience like the others, but that's where I met Maureen Donnelly. And the reason I bring this individual up is this is the person I did my PhD with. All of 4 or 5 years after that encounter, but my PhD advisor has known me for more than 50% of my life. I met her at 17. So that's something to be said about serendipitous encounters. But the other fun thing is that the Donnelly lab used to do interesting work on strawberry poison dart frogs in South and Central America. So Uafuga pomelia, the little pretty plastic-esque looking frog that you see as the poster child of cute frogs. And Uafuga, when you look at the genus name, egg eating. And we don't think about it as much. It's not just a pretty frog that can kill other things. It's also a frog where the female lays unfertilized eggs as well for its tadpoles to eat. So each genus of frog has really interesting traits that we don't think about beyond frog, egg, tadpole, froglet, if you will, and then the life cycle continues. So when I started thinking about what I wanted to do as my actual grad project, I was in a lab that did a lot of international fieldwork, so that was good. There wasn't any hesitations about, go back to India, figure out what you want to do there. Most of the fieldwork is Peru, Panama, French Guyana. I thought of French Guyana just because I didn't know Spanish. I figured I could get away there with English. You've got to think about all the logistics of actually running a field station of sorts and activities. So I was doing coursework and traveling back to India, driving around in one state in South India. And I'll lay the landscape for you out a little more in a moment. But I was driving around going, you go to this national park, and then you drive to the next national park, kind of on this like national park hopping tour to see what was an interesting landscape to look at. And then while I was doing these drives, I was just driving through vast expanses of plantation. And when I say plantation, like everyone has a different kind of picture in mind. So there's tea plantations, there's plantations with just cardamom, just cinnamon, just cloves. This is also the state of India that's the spice bowl of the country. Rubber, right? We use this blanket term plantation. Also secondary forests grown for fuel. We also call those plantation. So I was driving through all of this going, what does the literature say about amphibians over here? Looked it up, big gap, doesn't say anything in most places, and I'll tell you why. There's, just the history of the area lend itself to not having a lot of research done. India is also a fairly recent democracy. 1947 was when India was established as a country, if you will. So I go, okay, well, there's plantations. I'm going to start looking at what's in here. Now I'm going to take a moment to step back and like lay out the landscape for you, right? So when you think of the Indian map, like I don't expect any of you to know details, but there's this V at the bottom, right? Like that's probably the giveaway. It looks like this perfect peninsula. So the state that I'm talking about is something that runs right along the western coast of this peninsula. It's a long strip. Imagine Florida, but just on, just surrounded by water only on the west coast. And all of the research that I did was along a mountain range called the Western Ghats. So when you think about the Western Ghats, the word ghat actually means a stepped area where clothes are washed. So that's where the name originates from, and that's what some of the mountains in the northern part of this mountain range look like. So that's the origin of the name. It's a 1,000-mile long mountain range, so it's fairly long. Goes across several states, yeah. And the peaks, there are about 12 peaks that are above 8,000 feet, so not bad elevation-wise. They're not the Himalayas, I get that. They're fairly tall. And then there are valleys that are of all the depths you can imagine. Most of them don't go down to sea level. One does. So in this 1,000-mile long mountain chain, there's one real pass that is a huge, you can imagine transportation corridor and all of that, but also a huge driver of speciation north and south of this gap as well. So just kind of laying that picture. But even so, think of all these peaks with low passes, high passes. We call each of the tops of the mountains as sky islands. And not just for amphibians, but even for birds and orchids. These are areas of high species richness. And you almost see if there's a niche that has one species of bird on this mountaintop, people tend to be like, there's got to be another one on this mountaintop that's filling in the same ecological niche, and I've gone looking after them and searching for them and like found them, right? So we're still in an area that's having a lot of its diversity just being discovered and described and all that. Okay, so a little more about this mountain range. It's also one of the original 20 biological biodiversity hotspots. So some of you have learned about that in college. A biodiversity hotspot is by default a place that has a really large number of species, different kinds of organisms, whether it's plants, animals, across the board. But they also tend to be places that are the most threatened. So the variable could be anything, like high density of population, deforestation, climate change. All these variables tend to hit a little harder in what are called biodiversity hotspots. So you're talking high species rich area, but also huge anthropomorphic kind of impact, like huge human impacts in this mountain range. Okay, 2 more things about the mountain range, and then I'll stop about the mountain range. Rainfall, right? Precipitation. In southern India, most of the rainfall comes in the monsoons. And you've probably heard of these, it's like in stories and novels. We get 2 monsoons here. One is the southwest, starts in June, ends about September. And that's about 80% of the rainfall for the year. And it's torrential rainfall. Imagine pouring rain nonstop, 10 days, you don't see the sun, everything smells of fungal growth. You put a backpack down, 24 hours, the bottom of it is covered in fungus. It doesn't matter what it is covered in fungus, right? That level of just moisture through everything. Driving is a challenge. The landslides all the time, things getting stuck everywhere. But that's also what a lot of Indian agriculture depends on, the southwest monsoon. Then you have a second round, which is not as heavy, and this starts late October, ends by the early part of December. So there's these 2 peaks that bring in the maximum precipitation just comes in these 2 giant peaks. That also just gives you a signal of when you would go out and do field work when you're studying amphibians. You want to be there when the moisture is out. There's really slim returns when you're out in the field between December and June, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, so mountain range. This is all great. We talked about plantations. So let's move down that pathway. The area that I was working in is 10 degrees north of the equator. So pure tropical, nice, wet monsoons, 100% humidity most of the days. But when you take the tropics and then add elevation to it, you have climate that becomes a lot more temperate, right? Elevation always helps have things be a little cooler. That also provides the perfect environment for growing tea. And the British colonizers realized that in the 1850s. And they went, oh, wait a minute, it's a lot cooler to live up here. Tea grows here. They just started growing tea also in Northeast India. You've all heard of Darjeeling tea or Assam tea. But then they moved plants down to this part and realized that tea would grow perfectly well. It's also perfect weather for another I shouldn't say critter, but another organism, which is a BD or chytrid, which is a fungus that we know actually wipes out frogs in the New World. There have been waves of this fungus that just kind of get into an ecosystem, and then you can see thousands of frogs dead on the side of water, right? So you have this ecosystem that's perfect for everything, and there are people there, and the first tea plants were actually brought in the 1870s, and we still have some of those original trees growing, like they're old and crooked and all of that, but they're still around. Commercial tea plants are usually culled every 80 to 90 years because the rate at which they grow new leaves slows down a little bit. So they just kind of lop the entire field and put in new plants. Otherwise, tea can grow 7, 8 feet. Like it'll grow in 10, 12. I've seen really tall tea trees. We only think of tea as this little lovely bush that stays at about yay height, but that's not its natural disposition, of course. But what that does is, tea at this height is almost like creating an artificial canopy that's not, 10 feet, 12 feet, 13 feet high up. It's right close to the ground, and frogs tend to use it as a canopy that's lower down. So just putting that in there. Wherever tea is grown in the world, you can look at the literature and you'll find that there's something else also grown along with it, which means the natural ecosystem is cut down to grow what's called a fuel wood of sorts, because tea needs to be dried. It's not always, or it's seldom electric. Electric is a lot more expensive. It's usually something like eucalyptus or some variant of that that's a fast-growing species that they grow, and then every 7 years or 10 years, depending on what tree we're talking about, they just get culled and used in the factories. So there's a lot of area that gets completely clear-cut to take care of growing tea commercially. Something to keep in mind. All right, so I'm going to introduce you to the 3 landscapes now. We talked the 3 habitats that I worked with. You've already heard about tea. But that's the most permanent one in a strange way, because it only gets clear-cut every 80, 90 years. But it is actively sprayed with whatever concoction of chemicals you can imagine. Paperwork says something. What happens on ground is a very different story. And when you, I can never look at a package of organic tea the same way anymore, because your organic tea fields, here's the organic tea bush that doesn't have anything being sprayed on it. 7 feet away. This is your line for your non-organic or your standard growth tea. So when you have one tiny field surrounded by acres and acres of fields that are sprayed with everything on the planet, organic takes on a new meaning. But plantations, depending on, different companies work differently. I'm not trying to say there aren't companies that do it right. Just keep that in mind. Larger companies tend to try and have a tiny percentage of their property listed as organic, because that lets you sign off and get, rainforest certified and all of that good stuff. So there's loopholes everywhere. I don't mean to be a cynic, but it comes out. All right, so you have tea, has some amount of pesticides put on it, but it's been regular. The management practices on the land that I was working has been fairly uniform since 1870. So there's something to be said about the organisms aren't getting any new surprises. It's the same management plan. Every 30 days, women walk by picking off the top shoots and leaves, and then for the most part, they're left without too much disturbance. Then you have large swaths, large acreage of eucalyptus. Really nothing happens for 7 to 10 years, and then every 7 to 10 years, everything gets cut out and used, and then you move on, the plants will regrow, and then another 7 years they come in. So there's some real harsh disturbance, but again, not for a very, the time intervals are fairly uniform, and you know that. And then the third ecosystem, I should say habitat, calling it an ecosystem, it's not big enough. These patches aren't big enough to call them ecosystems, but it's all the places in between this matrix. So tea is very manually heavy in the kind of work, intensive in the kind of work that the women do. So there are no tea bushes on really steep slopes that go down into ravines that fill up during the monsoon when there's a lot of water coming in. And those are the areas also that have what we call shola forests or stunted forests, because the trees are protected from the heavy winds. So there are these little patches of high diversity forests that are native to the landscape that have been left untouched. So they're surrounded by tea, eucalyptus on all sides, but then you'll walk into this little patch that feels like you're in the middle of, the most untouched wilderness ever. So you have patches like that, you have tea, and you have the eucalyptus. Now, when you work in a landscape where there isn't historic data on what species existed in the area, you don't have a species list coming to you. 2, access to things is difficult. Even getting permission to work on this property was hard. So it took me 1.5 years of showing up fairly regularly at the head office of a tea company to have them let me work on their property. Except for the first year, I was not followed around, they told me the only way I was allowed to go to fieldwork was if I had someone from the company accompany me. And this was a watcher. And the deal was that I wouldn't chemically test. That's the title. The title is a watcher. I'll tell you more about watchers. Oh yeah, the watchers. The watcher made sure I didn't take water samples, sample the soil, or anything like that. So I can study frogs, but I can't do any So there's a lot of trust building that needed to happen. And I was like, I would love to know what's in the water and publish and talk about that. But there's a long way to get there. Watchers are part of the plantation's, administrative structure, to have a couple of people who just kind of keep track of everything. And when I say keep track of everything, I mean the herd of elephants that walk by once every couple of weeks. And if you know that the herd of elephants is on hill 2 by field 3, you don't take that route, you take another route, because otherwise you will get into trouble. Same thing with Gar. There are these water buffaloes that look like they have socks up to their knees. Scary. They're actually worse than elephants in the way they react to being surprised at night by field vehicles. They also keep track of whose cow is missing and why it's not. So kind of like a community support person. I actually appreciated becoming friends with watchers because they would know what was, what the tea was, who was in trouble, who wasn't. They knew. They knew what was going on. So the property that I worked on, and the reason I took so long to get permission was I figured if I work on getting access to the largest swath of land, I would then have a bigger playground than working with smaller business owners that had small patches of plantation. Then I would have to get permission from every group, and then anytime something changed, I'd have to go back up that channel. So the property that I worked with, a company that I worked with, is called Kannandev, and it's the single largest landholder in the area. It's kind of a co-op, but not. We can go into that. That's like a whole economics and social labor laws kind of conversation. But 58,000 acres. 58,000 acres of land. So it's a pretty large land holding. And Within that, there were 7 plantations, and each of them had the same administrative structure. There's a manager, there's an assistant manager, there's field managers. The field managers report to, the pickers report to the field managers, a very mirrored structure that made life really easy. All right, so when you don't know what methods work in a field place, because you're like, no one's really done any kind of repeated measure studies in here, you go in and you try all of them. So that was my first year. There are, several methods written out for amphibians. You have your standard transects where you walk in a straight line for 25 meters, look for a meter on either side, whatever you catch becomes a part of the transect, and then you measure and release them. So that's just along a straight line. You do the same thing in streams. So there are assumptions for each of these methods that affect the math that you do once you collect the numbers and all that. So I tried those both in the daytime and in the nighttime because my professor insisted that we were going to be thorough about everything. You create artificial habitats. You take little PVC pipes, tie them, so look at occupancy. So that's another way of thinking about counting how many individuals, density, and things like that. Quadrant. So I also did, you build out these 5 by 5 meter plots, and then not destructive sampling, but really thorough samplings where you make sure you've looked at pretty much everything that's under every leaf in there to see if you accounted for things. So there's a lot more. And then there's drift fences and pitfall traps. So amphibians and reptiles, you might, even if you haven't studied them closely, like once they hit a surface, they tend to just follow along the edge. So what you do is you create a bunch of these, use tarps, cut them up into little strips, figure out a way to make them stand vertical in the ground, some part of it buried underneath. So you create these little channels that force amphibians, reptiles, whatever in that place, to go into buckets that you submerge such that the lip is flush with the surface of the ground, right? So pitfall traps. And then you do the same thing, but using what are called funnel traps. A funnel trap is like I think it's a fisherman trap, actually. So think of a cylindrical mesh tube, and you have 2 funnel-shaped openings on each end, so an animal can go in easily, but can't come out. Again, all of these have problems. If you're not there at 5 a.m. to make sure you take the animal out, someone else is getting it. And by someone else, I mean the snakes that are around that area. And if you wait too long, they get cooked too. Like the heat can kill them. So a lot of these methods are really effort intensive. Just setting them up, getting out to them each day on a regular basis. And when you do all of these, you try to set them up to be as randomized as possible, as many replicates as possible, and all the good stuff. Jumping to results here, I got to 17 species in the very first year, and I knew these were unique species enough by just basic morphological identification. Again, I'm working with morphospecies because this is a place where a lot of the species were just being described. So between 2002 and 2016, we had over 116 new species of vertebrate and neurons described in this area, right? So we're still in a place where the splitting is happening, and then maybe in 50 years we'll come back into some lumping, but that's where we're at right now. So there were species that there were individuals that I could not identify down to species level, so it's like morphotype 1, morphotype 2. So 17, we were confident that they were different species. Didn't know what they were in some cases. There's phone calls at like 11:45 and you have the frog in your hand and you're going, I haven't seen this one before, can you tell me what it is? No, I mean, we had scant cell phone coverage, but that one was described in 2015 as a new species, and it's one of the largest frogs in the Western Ghats. It's called Gotixalis magnus. It's massive. I don't understand how we went without describing it until 2015, but they're that low in density, and they're that narrow in terms of their actual spread, right? So we know of species from this area where 10 square mile is the entire known habitat of a vertebrate. And in some cases, we still don't know life history Like, we just know that this exists. This is what the adult looks like. There's one or two holotypes one holotype and some paratypes in a museum, but that's about it. So when you're trying to do descriptive and community level biology in a place that doesn't have its basic species described, it is really challenging. And now, hindsight is 2020. I would have become a taxonomist, though I really didn't want to do that back then. So anyway, all right. So I did this for the first year. Figured out that walking in streams at night was the most useful technique that worked here in terms of the numbers of individual frogs that I was catching. And then the second best was, in terms of diversity, the largest different types of amphibians I was seeing was when I was in these small forest patches and walking along the stream. So in the forest patch, in a stream. So I said, okay, great. Now let's scale this up, because I was just working in one part of the plantation. So spread out to 4 different plantations, did that for 2 years, 2 seasons. So, 7 sets of each of these habitat types in each of these places. Again, repeats. 2,500 frogs later, and only 14 species, right? Less than the original, one smaller location. It was very clear that there were frogs that like to be in the tea. And by like, I mean you would go out one night and see 50 frogs in a tiny area, calling away, very happy on there. There were other frogs, toads mostly, that were okay and did, I can't talk about longitudinal work because this is kind of a timestamp of 2-3 years. Toads were doing fine-ish in, 2 species of toads were doing fine in the eucalyptus forest. You wouldn't see the other raccophorids that we were seeing on the tea bushes or on the little forest patches in the eucalyptus. So not the richest habitat for everyone, but for the drier, more terrestrial species, they worked. There was a lot more overlap in the species that we saw on tea and in the shola forest than we thought, the little forest patches that we thought would happen. But it's almost inevitable, because the matrix is so heterogeneous. You go from tea bush, tea bush, tea bush, tea bush, patch of forest, deep, like a little river. You slide down these things. Your bottom of the pants is brown. Climb up that one, and there's another tea patch 2 trees out, right? So really sharp ecotones, if you will, and yet they were there, right? This is one of those timestamp things, like these species exist over here this time. While this work was going on, I was also, all through the 4 years I was there, swabbing for chytrid, which is this fungus that we know that's been causing die-offs all over the New World, in some parts in Asia. In India, we had about four prior studies, and this is 2016, 2017. We had 4 prior studies done and not a single case of a positive report. My study corroborated that. We seem to have the ubiquitous strain of chytrid, but nothing that's causing any infections on our species. And I looked at, this wasn't just the ones I was seeing on transects, so more than what I was catching on the transects. So I'll stop there with just saying, this was a study that almost was miraculous that it happened, because after the study was over and I left, Munnar, the town, and the entire plantation went into a complete shutdown because of labor law issues. So we have these things called hartals in India, where it's a complete shutdown of life and everything else. And all the managers of the tea plantations were kind of forced or chased downhill into the bigger cities. And I had a few colleagues that I had also pulled in to start doing research and continue the relationship with the folks in the company. And all of that just came to a complete standstill. And then the pandemic hit, so there was all of that. I worked on developing an MOU with the organization and with what's called the Wildlife Trust of India to have, workflows so that someone didn't have to stand at a door and, kind of give up 6 months of their life to get permission to work on a property. So that's changed, but I tell you, there's enough work in this one agricultural landscape for I mean, decades and decades to come, where we're still describing new species from. We don't know the life histories of these frogs. And I will throw one life history tidbit out there just because it's so fascinating. When you think of frogs, you think of frogs that lay an egg hatches out into a tadpole in a water body, right? And then you have these little froglets or toadlets hop out of the water. There's a genus of frogs there called Rauercastus. That's kind of the majority of the frogs in this area are from this genus. And they're called direct developers. No connection with water at all. So these frogs lay these beautiful boba pearl-sized eggs whole. They lay them in leaf litter. They lay them on wet leaves, even on tea leaves. I have like pictures of like frog eggs literally sitting on a tea leaf. And they're transparent. So you can see all the developmental stages of life. Heartbeat starts, limb buds, tail. They go through all the stages. You can just see through this perfect window. You've heard of the chick embryo technique where you cut out a window into the egg. It's easier with direct developing frogs. And out hatches a froglet that's the size of half your fingernail. So imagine going out saying, oh, there's no diversity in plantations. And you walk a transect and one night you end up going, oh shoot, I just bagged 17 tiny froglets the size of my fingernail that I can't identify down to species because even the features are barely developed. We had a good sense of which species they were because of what's found on the tea bushes there. So don't write off agricultural habitats as places that you can't see diversity. And for sure, a more heterogeneous landscape, even if it's all plantation-based things, you know, one plant, another plant, something else, allows for a little more of the odds of some organism surviving. So when people say, what's the point in keeping that one tree at the corner of my yard? I'm like, keep the one tree in the corner of your yard. You don't know, right? If a tiny little, clump of 25 trees and a stream running through can have the diversity that we were seeing, there's hope yet for agricultural landscapes. Pay attention to them. It's not about, and you have to work with the people that run them. If I were to write something that was on the lines of, all tea plantations should be shut down in that place, that would be the end of that. There would be nobody going back to do research in these areas. So you kind of have to learn to work with the people there. And I will say this, when I first started working there, I used to have folks show up with, there's this venomous snake that's a pit viper that's not very harmful in the grander scheme of things. Like it doesn't produce enough venom to kill a person. There's been a lot of paralyzed arms and stuff like that. So when I started off, the tea pickers would show up at my doorstep because they're like, this is the person studying this kind of stuff with the head half cut off or whatever, and they'll with a sickle, they'll just drop it on the doorstep and be like, see. After the second year, that changed to them just taking a picture. Most of them have tiny little crappy cell phones made in China, so they'll take a picture of it and show me. And then by the third year, talking to the locals, there was a sense of pride in saying, I found a thing, I left it alive, give me a medal. There's a historical connection to this because when the British colonists ruled that area, you would get paid for every snake that was killed that you brought in. So there's also that cultural memory. Same thing with the mice, rats, not mice, the large rats. I think you got 2 annas, which is, I don't even know how many cents working backwards, but you would get rewarded for getting rid of this venomous pest, if you will. So, interesting story. I'm happy to answer any questions. The work continues. I have colleagues on ground, continuing to work on species description, getting genome sequences going so that field IDing is no longer a nightmare, because now there's kits that you can run PCRs in the field and things are easier. They existed when I was there. I just didn't get around to using it in my work, so yeah.
When you were working with the locals, did you find that they asked for some Chinese frogs?
100%. Every frog was a green frog. And they had terms, but it was all common language, Malayalam and Tamil words. I spoke the languages, that was helpful, but it was all lumped together. All the frogs that looked remotely green were all like the green frog, irrespective of whether one was, and that makes sense, right? For them, that was it. They were better at snakes. And it mattered because there are venomous snakes there that you do want to know the difference. And so, yeah.
2 questions.
Of course.
What state were you in? Kerala?
Kerala, yes.
Second, what was the environment like before you had tea plantations and stuff there?
So by default, these are tropical montane rainforests up to about 2,000, I think in meters. So that would be up to about 7,000 feet. And then above it, it shifted to what was called the Shola grassland ecosystem. Because the winds are so strong, no forests grew above that. So you could see a clear, like where the tree line was, and then there's grass. And then the only places you would have forests are in those crevices, and they would be these unique little biodiversity bubbles, yeah. So if you look up the Shola grassland ecosystem, that's where you'll hear a lot about that landscape. And it runs the entire length of the Western Ghats. So even the northern extents of this mountain range have the Shola grassland. So Shola is the forest part, and the grassland is, yeah. And just so I say that, there are frogs that are found exclusively on the blades of the grass up there at that elevation. One was described, I forget the year, but in the last 5 years, it's called Rauerkestris resplendent. It looks like it is the most crazy looking frog you will see. Think of a bright orange body with bright red things that look like patches of fat that have been put on. It's almost like a toad that's red, and then all the parotid glands and things like that are like a darker, deeper red. And it's yay big, and it lives on these blades of grass. It's insane. I wish I knew. We're just starting to do, natural history studies. There's a lot of people who love going into a landscape, taking all the specimens, running out and, get a paper for taxonomy. The harder work is to sit and watch and see what it's eating, see what it's interacting with, and things like that. Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Of course, yeah.
To each other. My first one is how did you end up then getting the trust of the locals and the watchers, and would you say that your identity as a woman maybe affected that? Because I feel I know the field is obviously very male dominated, and if you could speak.
Oh, that is such a big question. The latter part of it. So the first part was, can you repeat your first part of the question again?
Well, how you got their trust.
The trust. Okay, so that was just, I did a lot of talking, and it helped that I'm someone who likes to talk. I also spoke all the languages involved. So I spoke Hindi, which is kind of the national language, and that was common for most of the managers. I spoke Malayalam because that's where my parents are originally from the state of Kerala, so I grew up speaking that at home. The workers in tea plantations don't speak Malayalam. They were brought in by the British as coolies, as workers from the neighboring state. So they speak something called Tamil, another Dravidian language. The scripts look similar, but they're not really. You kind of have to learn it up. And knowing the language made a big difference, and I kept working on improving it. So I would just speak it wrong, and I think that helped them go, okay, she cares enough to want to learn, kind of thing. That was one thing. I taught in as many of the local schools as I could. So I would go there with a projector, there's a wall, and show them the pictures of what they had, right? No one stops and for them, this is what they grew up with. No one's looking at the frog that's hopping around. So I gave a lot of little talks in the local government schools. The teachers were very happy to not have to teach, and that worked out. And then when I said I would do something, or when I said I wouldn't do something, I just didn't. as much as it was, kind of, you want to get the data, you want to do this, it had to happen at a pace that didn't kind of kill the process before it started. So after the first year, Sir Watcher was like, she's not going to do anything, it's okay. But it took a whole year, and he hated it so much, because we were out between 7 p.m. and 4 a.m. pretty much every night in the pouring rain. It's not glamorous work. So he was happy to, say, be like, oh, no, she's good. I gave a lot of talks to people in the managers. They realized that there's middle ground, because I think there's this notion that if you're doing conservation biology, it's 100% forest, or, everything's dead and dying. It's barren wasteland. And there's so much between those two. And just constantly having that conversation as well. Again, that was helpful. I can't say that I can say that now, again, the Wildlife Trust of India has a little permanent station there on forest land. Again, this private property is also abutting protected forest land, and they're trying to work on some captive husbandry projects as a way to also learn about natural history, because we really don't know a lot about it. So there's a few more permanent things coming up, and the part about me being a woman, I was probably the only woman in so many rooms. Not just in the field biology part, but also in tea plantation formal managerial rooms, where it was almost like an asset to walk in with like the torn field, not torn, but like the field bro look, and safety was the biggest concern. India, depending on where you are, can be unsafe for women, but I will say this. As a woman who worked in the tea plantations, that community just kind of took me in. And I also told you that this is I didn't mention this as much, but this is also a very popular tourist place for both locals from India and people who come and visit Kerala. And the tourists are the annoying individuals. There were moments where, you'd get hassled by a tourist in town, but I was considered a local after a year or two. So people would be like, if someone messes with you, you let us know they're not going down the mountain. I was more worried about elephants, honestly, up there. We had a couple of close calls. There's nothing like a charging elephant in the middle of the night when it's pouring rain that makes all systems shut down. You feel the vibrations on the ground. And they mock charge, which is a good thing, because you know to get out of the way. I will share this. It's kind of sad news, but I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago in the village that I spent a lot of time. One of the guys who runs a auto rickshaw was basically killed by an elephant, and I know him. I've not met, but I used to use his services getting from the little village to the town often, and the elephant took him and just beat him up. These are elephants I have fantastic photographs of this particular male, like we all talk about him. But when elephants are in must, which is when their hormonal production is geared up for the reproductive season, they're a little more irrational, a little more aggressive, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time and you don't get out of the way in time, they can be aggressive. So that happened 2 weeks ago, and then the entire village shut down again because a couple of weeks ago someone else was killed by an elephant. So human-elephant conflict is not new in the area. This is something that happened. This is also an area that has had tigers kill people. That's changed now. There aren't as many big cats in the area, just because of the number of people out there. But elephants do their rounds. They stop at, there's this one tea, I call it a tea shop, but it's literally it's a tin can shop. and there's one elephant that'll come every month and beat it down on the side. And the guy's like, yeah, I know, Parayappa and I have, this understanding. He only hurts my shop, not me. And he'll build it back up and life goes on as normal. The plantations actually have an elephant damage contingency fund. It's a thing. you can't, yeah, it was a very different atmosphere there. What I struggled with a lot was more the urban setup there. So the first year I was there, police kept picking me up at night and dropping me back to my shack. They weren't happy that I was out doing fieldwork. In India, the way you protect women is like you coop them up inside and no one can harm them, right? You segregate like only girls' schools, only girls' buses. You'll see this, there are only women's buses. In a train, there's like an only women's compartment. So that's what we do. So that happened a couple of times where they would just be like, no, we're going to drop you back. And then you've lost time because it's a pain in the neck getting anywhere with these mountain roads anyway. But you don't argue with them because they're kind of it's the cultural kind of social capital, like you don't mess with the cops in India. So that happened a bunch. Traveling back and forth from the field site was always challenging. And then you fight for a spot at the table with built fieldwork in India. Like I would be the only woman taken to places because everyone else would need a bathroom. And I've learned now that I was doing a disservice to myself and to others by saying that's okay. Because men like, and everyone likes to use a bathroom, right? So if we could protest and get the money to have a small hole in the wall, something made, that would have benefited everyone. But you kind of, when you're the only one, you're like, you first want to make sure you can get there and prove a point. So there have been a lot of times when, it's like, okay, I can't climb the tree, watch. I can't do this, watch. I can't go on that 16-mile hike, watch. It's okay. And I have fantastic colleagues now on the ground who are like, yeah, they're making the changes that need to be made, and it's slow, but we're getting there. Yeah, I have some fabulous female herpetology colleagues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Jason.
Why do these plantations allow you to be there?
Allow me.
What is it that you mentioned that they're concerned about you measuring water quality and potentially the economic damage to their business maybe, but what's their advantage to allowing anyone to do research on these?
So for me initially, I basically told them that they would benefit from knowing what's on their property. I'm like, I'm not adding anything on, I'm not throwing frogs on there. Like what's there is there. I can give you a more accurate list of what you have. And I was also looking at snakes, and I had a colleague who I would send all the orchid pictures to once I even figured out something was an orchid. There are plants there that you would not call an orchid. Like even if you have some idea of what orchid taxonomy looks like, morphology looks like, you'd be like, no. And then you'd be like, oh, this is one of those unusual ones. So they were very interested in that. They really did want to learn more about what was on their land. Second thing, when you can show that there's wildlife and flora and fauna flourishing on your land, that's great for advertising. And this is a really large company. They don't sell to individual buyers. They're a company that sells to blenders, right? So they go to tea auctions, and it's usually like, what are you cutting the good tea with? That's where these guys come in. They have a couple of products that are really high-end products, but for marketing, that made a difference. Rainforest Alliance certification. The Rainforest Alliance certification folk wanted to see that they were involved in research looking at what they could do to mitigate any harm from plantation work. So one of the things that came up was they would stop spraying pesticides close, about 2 meters out from where there's a stream that would run in the monsoon. So little things like that. But they don't really have someone permanently in place to do that kind of stuff. So they were happy to have me be someone they could talk to about that kind of work. They have an R&D section, but it's mostly, how can you graft this tea variety to this tea variety, that kind of work. Soil pH, a lot of that counts for productivity for tea. And then keeping pests out. It's huge plantations. If one field gets infected, it's just a minefield of things going. So that was helpful. And then there was a lot of education. I took these people to species that they didn't know existed on their property, of giant orchids in bloom. Like you see the cultivated species of, calanthe or something like that in Home Depot, the original plant is out there in the Western Ghats. So just that education, I think they did value that a lot. And genuinely, there were, I can't say genuinely, like as a blanket statement, but there are several people in the management of the plantation who understand the impact of the work that they're doing, and we're open to having conversations about what could we do that doesn't affect our bottom line, or would affect it in a way that wouldn't be meaningful, that would allow for the ecosystem to be healthy. So there were definitely individuals who were okay with having that conversation. It took time to get there, but oh, absolutely.
There's good research for shade-grown plantations that attracting birds there
Yes.
reduces coffee borer pests
Yes.
and increases profitability
Yep.
for coffee growers. Is there evidence like that? No, there's not. That they eat? No.
Nothing like that. Getting into diet of these, I mean, that would be fantastic. Like I said, there's so much work there. And they'd be open to that kind of research. It took me, I had the right supervisor for a PhD like this, where it was like, go figure out what needs to be done, take the time it needs. PhDs aren't built like that, unfortunately. I had the right kind of funding, I had the right kind of support on ground to be able to do that, which I think, again, I got fortunate. Right time, right place, right set of people. Somewhere along the line, and this is how things work in India, because everyone is somehow related to someone else. We did find connections in the company as well that changed a little bit of the attitude. It allowed me to have conversations that I may not have been able to have if I didn't have those other connections. I used everything I had. And it was a big project. I'm glad I got to do the work, but it also did burn me out a little bit, as tends to happen after long degrees. Yeah.
So, like the high diversity in the forest areas,
Yeah.
like the toads that are in the eucalyptus and then the tea frogs, like, are those also in there?
No.
No, so like, and you didn't observe any like clear-cutting events,
Of the
like either one, the tea.
So yes, I did experience clear-cutting events of both tea fields and eucalyptus patches, but to have like a repeated measures project that doesn't get affected by these kind of variables, I'd kind of done my homework to make sure that it would be patches that weren't in the calendar to be cut, if that makes sense. Because if you don't have replicates in time, then you just have like 1 year of something, and that's hard to draw any kind of conclusions from. Ideally, this would be a long-term ecological station. Like, that would be the best. I've seen some of the toads in the borders of the forest, but the toads I would come across a lot more in my, I'm about town or walking around the plantation on paths and stuff like that. But as a part of the actual transects that were done, I can look at the data again, but there was not a single toad in the Shola forest with the streams in them.
I guess I'm asking because I'm wondering, like,
Yeah.
once the thing gets cleared up and then replanted,
There's just, yeah.
like the...
Do they move out and then come
like,
back? Yeah.
coming back to it,
Yeah.
like how would they move into those areas?
Yeah. No, fantastic questions.
Do you know?
No, I don't. I will say this. It was one field that surprised me, and this was the first year, and that's when I realized that I had to look into it. So I'd, put a transect through a tea field, and then I came back after a week, and the field had all the tea bushes basically chopped at the bottom, with the tea bushes just lying on the side. They wait for them to dry out, and then they use that also as fuel to dry other tea bushes. And I was like, oh crud, need to have more, more backup replicates so that I can lose a few or know exactly when this kind of stuff is going to happen. And here's the fun thing. This was, I don't remember if it was the first peak of monsoon or the second, but there was this one day when I went out, and it was not a data collection day, I was just out looking at stuff, and there were hundreds of frogs on these, cut down tea bushes that aren't attached to the stalks and, calling away breeding. There were, amplexed pairs on there. And so it would be really interesting to do one of those, in a more controlled fashion. If you had like replicates of 3 fields at least that had been cut down at the same time, and then you do a timed thing to see when are they gone, or do they leave at all, and yeah. There's so much work. So when you ask questions like that, it's so fascinating.
So interesting to hear
Yeah.
you tackling this kind of from the beginning.
Yeah, I didn't expect to. It was like, oh shoot. Always have extras planned. I mean, when you're doing field work, right? There were a couple of streams that, when I went out to like pick, you kind of draw a map and then you pull some random numbers out, put that in your GPS thing, you go out and you're like, okay, this stream will work great. And then comes the monsoon and it's not going to work great. I can't walk the stream because it's, so that's that one out of the window. So you always, that comes with like, you learn that very quickly. One season is all it usually takes of failures,
Did you also, did you ever test water or soil?
No, I did not. I didn't get to that. And there was so much of other stuff to do, even before getting to that. I didn't go that direction. They claim to test their water and soil as a part of the Rainforest Alliance work. Here's the thing. They spray stuff on it. I think it's stuff that doesn't have a very long half-life, given that there's healthy populations of tadpoles and fish also in these waters. There's native fish, which are unfortunately dying out quite a bit because they're throwing in things that they want to eat, the locals want to eat. So there's that. But you tend not to see a lot of growth in there. There's crabs, freshwater crabs in the mountain streams.
So you said that this property had some parts set aside that were organic practices, right? Or at least like partially organic?
Yeah.
So did you notice any differences like walking between those spots? Were there different frogs in organic, non-organic, basically saying?
I didn't have enough replicates to work with to do that by just eyeballing over a couple of nights. Nothing I could glean from. And here's the thing, right? It's not like every plantation had its organic field component. All the organic things were like in one like central thing, and it wasn't. It would have been a great treatment, non-treatment experiment. I know, I thought it back then, but it just didn't have the numbers to make it work. Yeah.
It's not sequestered from the other tea.
You wish. We all wish, but no, that's
It's like 2 meters or something.
2 meters, yeah, sure. I mean, the paths usually are about 1 meter because people are walking through the field to the left, field to the right, and they have these baskets that they carry on their back. So there needs to be enough clearance for that. I can look at the specific numbers, but it wasn't confidence inspiring. I can. No, at one point they tried, I remember, and this was later when I visited after I had finished data collection, and they started putting barriers, like these tarps, between the road and some of the main road that goes through town and some of the fields, and it was supposed to be some kind of barrier for chemicals, and I was just like, okay, in what universe? But I don't think that was, I have to look into it. Again, you have to realize my last year there doing the actual field work was 2016, so it's been a minute as well. And then ever since that, there was the workers shut down. That caused a lot of breaks in projects that even my colleagues were doing up there. And then the pandemic, I definitely know that they took a hit with that. And now, over the past week, it's been elephants. So have you all heard of kumkis? Is that a word that makes sense? Okay. So in India, there are these elephants that are female elephants that are trained with a mahat, like a mahat is like an elephant trainer. And they bring in female elephants to herd and trap and catch male elephants in musts that are troublemakers. So at this site, after the person that I knew got killed, they brought 2 of these trained elephants, and it's really difficult to transport elephants. He saw an elephant. He visited India for the first time in December, and he was like, elephant, and it's on the back of a truck being transported. There are temple elephants, and then there are trained elephants by the forest department, and these are usually elephants that they found as a calf and rehabilitated, so they're very comfortable with being around people. And then they train them, and I'm not sure, I don't know the details of this, so I might not be the best person to say this, but they somehow help with herding male elephants and musk. So they brought 2 of these females up to Munnar in transportation. There's a road, there's really no other way to get up there. And then the tusker started coming closer to the enclosure where these 2 female elephants were, and that was not what they wanted to happen. And I don't know if the elephants are still there. This is all in the last week, so I'll have to look at that. It's apparently worked in the past. I haven't looked at that literature, so it's fun.
Maybe one more question, or? Well, I'm sure, Dr. Linden, you stick around for a minute? Or?
Yeah, of course, happy to talk.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Dr.
course.
Linden, for being here. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for our good folks at JAM for making tonight's recording available. If you get a chance, I know you've been here, so you've seen it, but you can check out the online recording. Jordan's got this incredible illustration she custom made for introduce us in science that plays at the beginning of each video. So thank you to all your folks watching online tonight. And thank you to the Norwich Women's Club and Norwich Inn for past support of Suds and Science. Thank you all. Help yourselves, grab whatever you want besides the TV on the way out, and thank you.
One of the